After watching my A-list actor husband star in a steamy, R-rated thriller with a rising starlet, I accepted an invitation to join a divorce reality show. My best friend patted my shoulder with a loud laugh. Doing PR for your husband's new movie? Again, you're going all out for this. Everyone thought this was just playful banter between the entertainment industry's 10-year model couple. They all tried their hardest to play matchmaker and help us reconcile. On the show, the man who was notoriously quiet and never understood romance, clumsily but earnestly prepared surprises for me on camera. Yet no matter how hard he tried to please me, the end of every episode one selected that still wanted divorce option. Even the audience couldn't stand it anymore, flooding the internet with comments saying I didn't deserve him. It wasn't until the season finale, seeing my unwavering insistence on divorce, that his eyes turned red. He dropped to his knees right in front of me. Chloe, I have never done a single thing to betray you. Why won't you give me one more chance? I smiled. All right, I'll give you 3 chances, 3 questions. If you can answer just one of them correctly, I will drop the divorce. Everyone let out a collective sigh of relief, including Ethan himself. After all, when it came to knowing me, if Ethan ranked second, no one would dare claim first. But after I asked the very first question, everyone was dumbfounded. In the 3rd year of our marriage, my cravings suddenly changed. That year, what was my absolute favorite fruit? Hearing the question, the tense audience in the studio immediately relaxed. Ethan looked like a massive weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He even shot me a confident smile. Chloe, this is way too easy. Want to swap it for a harder one? I shook my head and wrote my answer on a card, handing it to the host. Just answer the question. Ethan's pen flew across his whiteboard in less than 2 seconds. He was done. When he flipped his board around to reveal the word apples, a wave of relief washed over the crowd. In the observer's booth, Olivia Hayes, this year's hot favorite for Best Actress, laughed and teased. It looks like Chloe is just throwing a little tantrum with Ethan. She might choose divorce every episode, but her heart is clearly still tied to him. You two are really making us, and the audience, part of your little role play, aren't you? I ignored her passive-aggressive teasing. I simply looked at a brimmingly confident Ethan. Are you sure that's your answer? Ethan's lips curled up. He leaned back in his chair, all his previous tension completely gone. Chloe, back then there were times we could barely afford to eat, but you would rather skip buying groceries just to buy apples. If it wasn't because you love them, why else would you do it? We even got into a huge fight over it. Besides, when it comes to anything regarding you, I couldn't forget it even if I tried. When those deeply affectionate, captivating eyes locked onto me, the studio erupted into deafening cheers. I stared at the face I had once loved so desperately. Without saying a word, I slowly turned to the host. The host, who had been swooning over our romance, smiled sheepishly. She quickly pulled out my answer card, fully intending to announce Ethan's victory. But as her eyes scanned the card, she froze. A flash of pure shock crossed her eyes. Mr. Vance, you got it wrong. In an instant, the studio went so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The confident smile on Ethan's face stiffened, but having weathered countless PR storms, he quickly regained his composure. Chloe, you aren't doing this on purpose, are you? I remember photos of you buying apples went viral back then. Your fans even nicknamed you the Apple Beauty. Not to mention you were slicing apples at home every single day. The whole house smelled like apples. How could I possibly remember it wrong? In the audience, Ethan's superfans began to defend him. Exactly. During an interview back then, you even said you were super interested in fruit farming and wanted to plant your own apple trees. If that isn't loving apples, what is? Chloe, you've already made things so difficult for Ethan. In the previous episodes, could you stop pushing your luck? I ignored their aggressive questioning and calmly asked Ethan, do you remember what happened that year? Ethan let out a cold chuckle. Of course I do. I offended some powerful people and was practically blacklisted by the entire film industry. If you hadn't stayed by my side and encouraged me, I probably never would have gotten the chance to make my comeback. That's why I can't figure it out. We survived those brutal days together. So, why do you want to walk away from me now? His eyes grew dark, carrying a profound, indescribable sorrow. The cameras and fans frantically snapped photos of his vulnerability. I remained ice cold. Yes, because of some drama, you offended an A-list director and couldn't get a single role for over half a year, until a low-budget indie art house film approached you. They wanted you to play a mute orchard farmer who falls in love with a city girl, only to be abandoned by her. Honestly, you can barely even find that movie online anymore. But that specific role is what laid the groundwork for your massive comeback. It was because that niche indie film got critical acclaim that you were able to return to the big screen and book the blockbuster that made you the massive star you are today. Do you remember all of that? My voice grew quieter as I spoke. The grief I tried so hard to mask began to bleed through my words. Yet Ethan still looked entirely confused. What does that have to do with your question? I looked up at this man. The man who claimed to know everything about me, yet had completely erased the reality of our past. Let out a bitter laugh. Did you forget that when that role was offered to you, you didn't want it? You didn't want to stoop so low as to play a rural farmer? You wanted to reject the script outright. I was the one who forced you to take it. I was the one who went out every day to buy apples and saplings. I spent hours in our backyard researching how to plant them, studying the differences between apple varieties, writing notebooks full of research. Those notes became the foundation of your character research. I was the one enduring the blistering sun and pouring rain. But in the end, you were the one who got all the fame and glory. Years of deep-seated resentment made me want to scream, but my rational mind forced the agony down. Ignoring my grief, Ethan maintained his eerie calm. Okay, so, what was your favorite fruit? Looked up at him. I was so used to him casually brushing past my pain. I said flatly, green tangerines. Hearing that answer, Ethan suddenly laughed. Even Olivia, sitting in the observer's booth, couldn't help but interject. Chloe, it's a known fact that you hate sour things. Look, even if you feel like you sacrificed a lot for Ethan back then, and want some payback now, there's no need to tell a self-contradictory lie there. The entire studio's gaze bore into me, but I didn't feel an ounce of pressure. I just said calmly, you're right. What exactly do you think caused my cravings to change so drastically? I looked at Ethan and caught a fleeting, subtle flash of guilt in his eyes. I smiled. I stopped looking at him and shifted my gaze to Olivia, who had been gunning for me all night. 'Cause back then, I was already pregnant. Under the shocked gasps of the entire studio, Ethan lost his composure. He clearly hadn't expected me to reveal this. His voice was laced with panic and shock. Chloe, you never told me. Second question. I coldly cut off his interrogation. What is my favorite movie? This question was a trap. For the years, whenever I was asked this in public interviews, my answer was always different. But they all shared one common trait. My answer was always Ethan's next movie. When he first made his comeback, it didn't make much of a splash. It was me who willingly burned my own public goodwill, constantly bringing him up in my interviews, using every glowing adjective in the dictionary to hype up his movies, just to get the public curious about him again. Later, a paparazzi happened to catch a video of him visiting me on set. Despite coming from an elite family and looking flawlessly glamorous, when I tossed my half-eaten lunchbox at him, he ate my leftovers without a hint of disgust. After that video leaked, Ethan was instantly crowned the entertainment industry's ultimate good husband. Suddenly offers 4 perfect husband roles came flooding in, many from top-tier directors. But he politely declined them all, citing one single reason: I would get jealous. In the public eye, I became the obsessed, insanely jealous wife, while he was the brilliant talent, whose career was being held back by his overwhelming love for me. Thinking of the past, I gave a self-deprecating laugh. I looked quietly at Ethan, waiting for his answer. Roman holiday. Ethan looked incredibly confident. Chloe, I know I'm right about this one. I read your diary. You wrote that you and I were like the main characters in Roman Holiday. Just in reverse you. You also wrote that it was your favorite movie, but it had your least favorite ending. Actually, I've always wanted to tell you. We will never be separated like the characters in that movie. I've been using my actions to prove that. Status and background are illusions. Our love can overcome anything. So why won't you just give me a chance? The host's hand visibly trembled as she held the second answer card. The studio lights, previously warm and flattering, suddenly seemed harsh, casting long, interrogating shadows across the stage. Ethan's confident smile remained plastered on his face, though the edges of his mouth twitched. He was waiting for the applause. He was waiting for me to break down in tears of nostalgic joy, to fall into his arms, to play the role of the devoted, humbled wife he had written for me. The host swallowed hard, her eyes darting between Ethan and the card. Mr. Vance, the answer is incorrect. A collective gasp swept through the audience. Ethan's smile didn't drop, it shattered. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of his podium so tightly his knuckles turned a bloodless white. What? That's impossible. I read it. I read your diary, Chloe. You wrote it in your own handwriting. You did, I replied, my voice a quiet, steady hum beneath the growing murmur of the crowd. You read the diary I kept in my nightstand. The entry dated November 14th of our 4th year of marriage. Exactly. Ethan pointed at me, turning to the audience, as if appealing to a jury. She wrote that we were like the characters in Roman Holiday, but that we would never be separated. It was a metaphor for us. It wasn't a metaphor for us, Ethan, I said. The heavy silence in the room seemed to press against my eardrums. Do you remember where you were on November 14th? Ethan blinked, the panic now visibly rising in his chest. I was shooting Midnight Sunday.
It was a closed set.
I was working. You were shooting the climax of that movie, I corrected. And I was at home, alone. That was the day the cramp started. That was the day the green tangerines sitting on our kitchen counter suddenly smelled like rot. In the observer's booth, Olivia's smug expression had completely vanished. She sat frozen, her lips slightly parted. The audience was dead silent. Even the cameramen seemed to hold their breath. I tried to call you, I continued, staring directly into the lens of the main camera, though my words were solely for the ghost of the man I once loved. I called your assistant, I called your manager. I called you 47 times.
But you were deep into your method acting.
You had instructed your team that under no circumstances were you to be interrupted. Ethan's face drained of all color. Chloe, no. I drove myself to the hospital in a torrential downpour, I said, my voice completely devoid of tears. I had cried them all out years ago. I sat in the emergency room waiting area for 6 hours. And when the doctor finally saw me, our baby was already gone. Someone in the audience let out a muffled sob. When I got back to our empty house 3 days later, I wrote that diary entry. I said, my gaze dropping to my hands resting calmly in my lap. I didn't write it about you, Ethan. I wrote it to the child I never got to meet. I told them that we were like Roman holiday, a beautiful, fleeting dream that ended too soon. And I promised my baby that, in my heart, we would never be separated. Ethan staggered back a step. He looked like he had been physically struck. You were pregnant? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ever say anything? I tried, I whispered softly. For months after I tried. But you were so busy celebrating your new box office records. You were busy giving interviews about how much you sacrificed for your craft. And then, I glanced up at the observer's booth. Then came the R-rated thriller. With Olivia. Olivia flinched violently. I sat in the VIP screening room. I said, my voice finally taking on a sharp, serrated edge. I watched my husband, the man who couldn't be bothered to pick up the phone while I was bleeding out, perform a violently passionate, beautifully choreographed love scene with his co-star. I watched you look at her on that screen with a fire you hadn't shown me in years. You gave her everything I had been begging for. And that was the night I accepted it. Accepted what? Ethan croaked, his voice cracking. That the Ethan Vance I loved died a long time ago. Or maybe he never existed at all. I turned to the host, who was openly weeping now. Read the card. Tell him my favorite movie. The host wiped her face with the back of her hand and held the card up to the microphone. Chloe's answer is, the security camera footage of Mercy Hospital ER, November 14th. Because it's the only piece of film in this world, I said coldly, that reminds me never to trust a man who acts for a living. Chaos erupted. The director in the booth was screaming into the host's earpiece, but she ignored it. The live feed wasn't cut. The ratings were undoubtedly skyrocketing, the network executives too greedy to censor the rawest television history ever broadcast. Ethan dropped to his knees. The graceful, PR-trained facade he wore like a second skin completely melted away. He crawled toward my chair, his hands grasping at the hem of my dress. Chloe, please, he begged, tears streaming down his perfectly sculpted face. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know. If I had known, I would have left the set. I would have burned the studio to the ground. You have to believe me. I looked down at him. There was a time when seeing Ethan cry would have shattered my heart into a million pieces. Now, I felt nothing. Just a hollow, echoing exhaustion. It doesn't matter what you would have done, I said calmly, gently pulling my dress from his grip. Because you didn't. You failed the second question, Ethan. Give me the third, he screamed, his voice raw, echoing through the cavernous studio. You promised me 3 questions. I can get the last one. I know you, Chloe. I swear I know you. Ask me anything. Please, don't end this. The audience, previously divided, was now completely united in a horrified, mournful silence. They had spent weeks watching this man prepare breakfasts, buy flowers, and profess his undying devotion on camera, only to realize they were watching a monster wearing a human suit. Fine, I said. I signaled the floor manager for a whiteboard. I didn't need to write the answer on a card this time. I already knew he wouldn't get it. Question 3, I said. I leaned down, bringing my face level with his. On the night of our 5th anniversary, you came home drunk. You had just won Best Actor. You fell asleep on the couch and your phone buzzed. I looked at it. Ethan's eyes widened in sheer terror. In the booth, Olivia abruptly stood up, knocking her chair over. The microphone caught the sharp clatter. I didn't pack my bags that night. I didn't scream. I just made you breakfast the next morning, I continued, my voice a soothing, lethal whisper. What was the text message, Ethan? And who was it from? Ethan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked wildly around the room, then up at the observer's booth. The camera immediately panned to Olivia, capturing her pale, terrified face. It was... Ethan stammered, his eyes darting back to me. It was just a colleague, congratulating me. Write it down, I commanded. He picked up the marker with trembling hands. He stared at the whiteboard. A drop of sweat rolled down his temple, splashing onto the pristine white surface. 10 seconds passed. Then 30. The silence was deafening. He couldn't write it because he knew that if he did, his career, his reputation, and his entire life would be incinerated on live television. He dropped the marker. It hit the floor with a hollow thud. I don't remember, he whispered, staring at the floor. Liar, I said. I stood up, adjusting my skirt. I walked over to the host and took her microphone. The text message, I said, my voice echoing through the studio, was from Olivia Hayes. It said, leaving your bed to go to your wife is the hardest acting you've ever had to do. Come back soon. A deafening uproar exploded in the studio. Fans in the front row screamed. Olivia, trapped in the glass booth, covered her face with her hands and sprinted for the exit door, but the cameras tracked her every move. I knew, I said, looking down at Ethan, who was now curled on the floor, weeping uncontrollably. I knew for 5 years. I stayed because my family's money was tied up in your production company, and I refused to let you ruin my father's legacy. I stayed until the contracts expired last month. I smiled for the cameras. I played the jealous wife. I let the world think I was crazy because it bought me time to untangle my life from yours. I tossed the microphone onto his empty chair. It let out a sharp, piercing screech of feedback. You failed all 3 questions, Ethan. The divorce papers are already filed. My lawyers will contact yours tomorrow. I didn't wait for a response. I turned my back on the cameras, the screaming audience, and the man sobbing on the floor. I walked off the stage, the rhythmic clicking of my heels the only sound that mattered to me. 2 months later, the rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my high-rise office. I stood with a cup of black coffee, watching the city below. The smog and neon lights bled together in a beautiful, chaotic watercolor. He's downstairs again. I turned. My assistant, Maya, stood in the doorway, an iPad clutched to her chest. She looked anxious. Security says he's been sitting in his car in the rain for 3 hours. He wants to know if you'll just give him 5 minutes. Tell security that if he steps foot in the lobby, they are to call the police and file a restraining order, I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. No exceptions. Understood, Maya said, tapping furiously on her screen. Also, the quarterly reports for Vance Productions just came in. Let me guess. I smiled faintly. Bloodbath.
Worse.
A massacre, Maya replied, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. Since the reality show finale aired, 3 of his major brand endorsements have dropped him due to morality clauses. The studio behind the new sci-fi epic recast his role. And Olivia Hayes. What about her? Her PR agency dropped her. She tried to release a statement claiming Ethan manipulated her and that she didn't know you were married. A bold lie, considering she attended our wedding, I noted dryly. Exactly. The internet tore her apart. She's been essentially blacklisted. Meanwhile, the indie film you just funded under your new production banner was selected for Cannes. I nodded, feeling a quiet sense of peace settle over my shoulders. The transition hadn't been easy. The fallout from the reality show was nuclear. The media camped outside my gated community for weeks. But the public, fickle as they were, had overwhelmingly sided with me. The Apple Beauty they once mocked as a jealous shrew was suddenly hailed as a master strategist who had survived years of emotional abuse with absolute grace. My father, who had been furious when I first married this struggling actor, had simply sent me a bottle of $10,000 vintage champagne with a note that read, "Welcome back to the real world, kid." My phone buzzed on the desk. An unknown number. I let it ring, knowing exactly who it was. Ethan had cycled through dozens of burner phones since I blocked his primary numbers.
He was spiraling.
Without my quiet, invisible hand guiding his career, reading his scripts, managing his temper tantrums, and smoothing over his PR disasters, he was free-falling. The voicemail notification popped up. I put my coffee down and tapped play on the speaker. Chloe. His voice was slurred, ragged, laced with alcohol and desperation. Chloe, please. I'm drowning. I can't do this without you. The house is so big. It smells like nothing. It doesn't smell like apples anymore. I bought a tangerine today. I tried to eat it, but it was so sour, I threw up. I miss you.
I'm sorry.
I'm so fucking sorry. I'll give up acting. I'll quit. I'll be the farmer. We can plant the orchard. Just open the door. Please. I listened to his sobbing until the machine cut him off. I didn't feel a pang of sympathy. I felt like a zoologist observing an animal in a cage of its own making. Should I block this number too? Maya asked softly.
Yes.
And have legal send him a cease and desist. If he contacts me again, I'll release the financial records of how much he embezzled from our joint account to buy Olivia her condo. Maya's eyes widened, but she nodded sharply. Right away, boss. As she left, I turned back to the window. The reflection staring back at me was no longer the exhausted, hollow-eyed woman from the reality show. She was sharp, composed, and undeniably dangerous. Ethan Vance thought our marriage was a movie. He thought he was the undisputed leading man, and I was just the tragic, supportive background character whose only purpose was to further his character arc. But he forgot the golden rule of cinema. The director is the one who ultimately controls the final cut. And I had just yelled cut for the very last time. I took another sip of coffee, watching Ethan's black SUV slowly pull away from the curb in the rain, disappearing into the dark, indifferent city. It was the perfect ending shot.